Have you ever felt just so inspired by something, or maybe you've had goals and ambitions and things that you've wanted to grow in, and every year when that New Year's resolution comes, maybe rather than excited for that resolution, maybe there's an anxiety or a fear or a shame complex added to it because year after year, even though you have these inspirations and ambitions, they always seem to fall short. See, the beautiful thing about that is that you were created to be an ambitious person. See, I believe that God has created us. The word literally tells us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And there is so much within us that is yet to be explored, and so much within us that is yet to be accomplished. What do you do with these passions, these ambitions, these inspirations of your life that hopefully are in agreement with the value system of your life? And here's a plan to how to accomplish those things and become that sort of a person. So what is the 4 pillars spiritual exercise? It's certain pillars or values in our life that we really can't live without. The first is spiritual, and I think it's so important that as Christians we do put the spiritual first. It's the most important pillar of our life. The reality is that if the spiritual is not honored, then all else will fall apart. We see this when Jesus says in Mark 8:36, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul?" And usually when we get busy or anxious about our lives, this is actually the first thing we sacrifice in our lives. So how do we flip the script? And rather than say that this is the first thing that can leave our life is the spiritual disciplines and growing in the spiritual practices, what if we had such a priority in our lives that the harder life got, this is something we actually cling to even more? The second would be business. And what I mean by that is that we are made to work. For instance, before the fall of man, before sin ever existed, consider Adam and Eve, that they were given work by God to tend to the garden. And what we as believers can learn from this pattern of God's creation of the first man ever created was that we are made to work, and we can cultivate our own versions of our garden as a way to even worship God. How do we not see work as a burden, but an opportunity to worship God in a different way? Third is personal. And what I mean by this is that you can't invest in others if you don't first invest in yourself. So do we have a priority for how we take care of ourselves? In other words, there's this saying that hurt people tend to hurt people. But on the other hand, what if whole people could help people? So how are we becoming whole people emotionally, physically, mentally? How are we investing in ourselves? I love what Proverbs 19:8 says, that to acquire wisdom is to love yourself. People who cherish understanding will prosper. And the last would be relational. So this is community, right? And community is a gift that God has given us. And I would go so far to say that God has designed us to live in intentional community. And I believe that community can actually be a very important pillar in our lives for our own spiritual formation. And I love what Proverbs 27:17 says, that as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. So those are the 4 pillars: spiritual, business, personal, and relational. And that's a value system I believe that as believers we want to incorporate in our lives and have a good balance for how each of these can be a way that we grow to be, one, the best versions of ourselves, yes, but 2, a way that we can be stewarding the gift of life and time that God has given us and orchestrate that as we can worship Him with that. So that's a little bit of the heart behind the 4 pillars spiritual practice, but now let's do the practice. I want you to go ahead and write down in a given week every single thing that you do. Not just what you do, but even what you would hope to do. Primarily focus on the weekdays, as that's where a lot of more consistency will come. Maybe you do things on the weekend that are more spontaneous, like going to a monthly worship night, or going to the movies, or going bowling with friends, or traveling. But it's likely that you're not doing that every single weekend unless you're on a bowling team. If that's you, good for you. But, church, for instance, happens on a weekend, and that's probably something that we commit to on a weekly basis. We also want to remember what the 4 value systems are, right? Between the spiritual, the business, the personal, and the relational. So for each thing that you're writing down that you do, I want you to think, Does this match my spiritual life, or does this go under the category of business? Does this go under personal or relational? So for this next portion of the process, take some time to just reflect on your own life and write down those things that you do or that you want to do in your life. And when you're ready, we'll continue with the process. So after you have written down all of the weekly commitments that you give yourself to, you've listed how much time you want to give to these certain things that you do, and you've categorized them between one of the values. Now what we want to do is enter the draft. And what we're going to do is have 4 rounds on this draft, and just like we went in that chronological order, the first and foremost, most important part is going to be the spiritual. Then we work ourselves to the business, then personal, then relational. And that will all be within the first round. So round number 1, with the first pick, you're going to say, okay, what is the number one thing I want to prioritize in my spiritual life? Then you want to work to, okay, here's my business. With the number 2 pick of prioritization in my life, I have to work. I have to honor that I've committed myself to working to make a living. And so that would pretty obviously be the next thing. I will say this. For most of these, they might range from 2 hours to 5 hours to 10 hours. For work, you're going to probably average somewhere between 45 to 50 hours a week. So go ahead that if you are working a full-time job, what I want you to do is for the first round, for the business category, I want you to write down work. But then when we get to the second round, I want you to write down work as well. Because if you don't, you'll get to that second round and think, well, I already wrote work. What else should I do with my business life? But the reality is, work is so much more than these other categories that are a lot smaller. So go ahead and write work down for that first round and that second round. So after that first round, what we've done is we've selected the highest priorities of each category. So for the first, it should have been a spiritual practice. The second, it should have been business, which would have been work or school. The third would have been something like sleep or whatever else taking care of yourself would have looked like. And the fourth would have been something relational. Then we do the same thing in the second round. I want you to do that again for the third round and then again for the fourth round. So after you finish your draft, you'll notice that from all those categories and all those commitments that you wrote down, the amount of hours and what category they fall into, you should have drafted most of those things. Now, you might find one of two things. On one hand, you might think, well, I didn't draft all 4 rounds. And so here's what I would say to you. Maybe there's an opportunity and a margin in your life to go, I want to grow in more things. What is lacking in my life? Maybe I want to be more relational in my life. Maybe I want to grow in my spirituality. Maybe I want to grow in how I take care of myself. If you have a free slot and you couldn't think of anything from the categories and commitments from your previous draft, then maybe grow in something. Maybe write something down. Hold yourself accountable and challenge yourself to grow in a category that you might want to do better in. The second thing might be, well, there was a lot of things that I wrote down that I do, but they didn't all fit into my draft life. Then my encouragement would be, really consider, are these things quintessential? Okay, here's where we get a little mathematical. In the next round, here's what we're gonna do, and I'm gonna put this on the screen, so don't freak out. If I asked you how many hours are in a day, you would say 24. How many days are in a week? 7. So what we want to do is go, okay, 7 times 24, that means there's 168 hours given in any week. There's a formula that we're going to follow, and it's the hours of a commitment divided by 168 hours in a week times 100, And what that's going to equal is the percentage of how much time we're giving to something. So for example, I go to church every week, and what I'm going to do is take 2 hours out of that church service, and I'm going to divide that by 168 hours that are in a week, times that by 100, and the number I get is 1.19%. Another example might be I sleep, right? And my goal is to get 8 hours of sleep every night. So I'm going 8 hours times 7 days in the week, which would be 56 hours divided by 168. And that actually equals 33.33%, because that's under, I'm going to round down, and that's 33% of my week is hopefully getting good sleep so that I can be taking care of myself and ultimately giving my best yes to what the next day has for me. So what I want you to do is that very thing. We're also going to put a percentage key on the screen, and that way it can hopefully help you have a little bit of a cheat sheet to do some of the math. And then what I want you to do is add up all of your percentages. So for church, 1%, for sleeping, 33%, maybe 2% of your life is going to something else. And so I want you to continue to add up what are the things that I'm doing on a weekly basis, how much time am I giving to them, and what percentage is ultimately adding up to my life. I did this with a friend, and after he went through all of that, he realized that 91% of his life is given to the different commitments of what he does week in and week out. That was actually really good news for him, because he realized that there was a 9% free space of margin in his life to give himself to other things. He realized, wow, I have time to actually catch up with my parents and talk to them. I have time to stop and talk to the stranger on the street and maybe love them and pray for them and maybe help them in some way. I have time to rest and relax more than I thought. Maybe there's margin in your life to take a nap one day. Amen. But what I like to say is that there's holy interruptions that God sometimes wants to put in our lives. And what I've realized is a lot of times I'm a very schedule-oriented person. And if I feel like I'm going from one thing to the next, I become a very stressed out person. I feel like I don't have time for that holy interruption, to love that person, or to be available for whatever the Lord wants to do. So my hope is that by doing this practice, you're starting to realize there's some order in your life, that there's priorities that you want to take serious. There's a balance to the value system of your life, whether it's the spiritual, the business, the personal, or the relational. The final thing I want you to do is build your personal calendar based on the values that you have written down and the things that you want to commit to. How do these things fit into your calendar on a weekly basis? When will you allow time for them? And commitment and consistency is going to be the key. So again, on the screen, I've given you an example of a calendar system. I think this is a really helpful thing, because what it does is it holds us accountable. We have a plan in place to the priorities that we want to have with the value system of our life. And if we follow this week in and week out, I think that we'll find that we feel healthier, we feel more confident about our decisions. And I think best of all, you will find that not only are you becoming a better and more transformative person, but you are gaining a better glimpse of how intentionally faithful God is in your life. It's my hope that yes, this exercise and this experience has helped you, but it's also my hope that it's brought you closer to the Lord. And throughout the process of engaging with this newfound plan in your life, you will grow not just to know yourself better, but to continue to know God better.